thank you for having me here, especially in English. I appreciate it. Hopefully there will be enough pictures and context that if I speak a little too fast, you can still follow me, but feel free to ask questions at the end. While it has long been acknowledged in theater that the play is the thing, literary forms of narrative, including fan fiction, also frequently include game elements and the pleasure of experimenting with new persona. While the fixed written form of fan fiction may seem markedly different from the fluid, enacted, and embodied nature of role-playing games, fan fiction production, circulation, and reception replicates many of role-playing games' key themes, pleasures, and practices. Rather than a completely static literary practice, fan fiction comprises one part of a much larger and densely interconnected transmedia network, with both professional and fan-created components. Because fan fiction is circulated in the same virtual and real spaces as fan video, fan art, and fan audio recordings, each of these forms strongly influence each other, making it difficult to draw clear distinctions between where fan fiction ends and fan role-playing games like cosplay begin. This paper thus maps the interconnections between fan fiction and role-playing games, exploring fan fiction as gameplay, fan fiction as role-play, and the dense network of transmedia story elements and practices that make clear distinctions between these forms increasingly difficult to delineate. Several fan scholars talk about fan fiction, fan video, and fan art as a form of creative play within the parameters and character archetypes, or rules, set by the source text, often described as a shared imaginative space. Thus, for many scholars, fan works unfold much like a role-playing game, where players all develop pre-established characters and explore a co-created imagined space together. In his lecture, All Over the Map, and his article, Game Design as Narrative Architecture, Henry Jenkins discusses the quality of world building that encourages this playful orientation to narrative. He explains that stories which primarily describe spaces encourage both professional and fan authors or players to interact with the fictional setting and further develop and manipulate the story elements. Similarly, in her article, Writing Bodies in Space, Media Fan Fiction as Theatrical Performance, Francesca Cappa argues that fan fiction can be understood less as writing a novel and more in terms of writing a play, staging the bodies of actors mixed with the co-imagined bodies collectively constructed by fans. Because the bodies and spaces of mass media story worlds are to some extent already known and shared among fans, Kappa argues that fan fiction authors become more like directors, restaging a new version of a collectively known play. Kappa's and Jenkins' work point the way toward understanding how fan culture and the reuse of shared mass media objects inject fan fiction with strong elements of both roleplay and gameplay. As a result, both the authors and readers of fan fiction may be thought of as playing in the same narrative toy box as participants in role-playing games. Further, as argued by Mary Laurie Ryan in Narrative as Virtual Reality, most narrative forms involve the temporary experience of identifying with another person and navigating the story world from their perspective. While viewers and readers generally appear to do so by following a fixed track, as opposed to participants in role-playing games who embody their character and actively choose their path through a story, many aspects of fan fiction production and culture complicate this distinction. Both from the perspective of fan fiction authors and readers, fan fiction functions more like a user-controlled, choose-your-own-adventure story than a completely fixed and closed novel format. First, the act of writing fan fiction may most clearly be understood as a form of role-playing game because, as in Kappa and Jenkins, the authors enter a partly pre-formed story world with partly pre-constructed characters, and then make choices about which characters to inhabit and how to navigate the story space. Some types of fan fiction authorship even more clearly bring together literary and role-playing game practices, as when multiple fans author a single story together by each representing one character in a chat room. As each one types their character's thoughts and actions, the chat transcript can become a piece of fan fiction, often subsequently re-uploaded to an archive or other fan platform. On the other hand, the experience of reading fan fiction may feel more like a choose-your-own-adventure story or a role-playing game, because at its very basis, fan fiction offers numerous versions of the same events in the same story world and using the same characters. By navigating from story to story, trying on many different iterations of a shared premise, fan fiction readers play through many possibilities and experiences. By choosing which versions of the story world to read and which characters to identify with, fan readers can control how they experience, embody, and navigate the story space, much like participants in role-playing games. The following fan video can be understood as a metaphor that demonstrates the principle of fan fiction as role play within a gaming context. Hourglass by Jean Duakis presents a collage of many different TV series that have used the same premise as the film Groundhog's Day, requiring that characters constantly relive the same day until they get it right. This structure mirrors many types of role-playing game in which characters must try many different ways of navigating the game and story space until they find a path and a series of behaviors that work and allow them to reach the end. It also mirrors the way in which reading fan fiction enables audiences to embody characters who constantly replay scenes, experiences, and actions within the game or story world, and then reset and do it all again, searching for the most pleasurable and exciting way to navigate the story space. By choosing which piece of fan fiction to read next, featuring which characters, like the Groundhog's Day format, fan readers get to experience an endless number of tactics for playing with the story's affordances. As a story-based form of gameplay, fanfiction draws upon long historical antecedents. Oral storytelling traditions often included game elements like competition, festival performance, goal or challenge-oriented production, and call and response collective improvisation. Similar to Jenkins and Koppa's work, oral stories often also primarily reinterpret stock archetypes within a collectively well-known story space. The numerous iterations of what happened in Camelot or how Greek heroes lived may be considered ways of playing with the same characters and premise. Oral storytellers thus expect that their audience may already know a version of the story, and often playfully compete to tell a better or more surprising version. Even high art literary works often reiterate these practices, especially among literary societies and friendship circles, such as the famous competition between Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, and John Polderoy during a dreary house party that resulted in Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. Fanfiction likewise incorporates its own festive calendar of holidays, challenges, and exchanges, as well as any number of more informal rivalries, competitions, and collaborative, goal-oriented playful projects. For example, the open, multi-authored project 101 Ways to End Up in a Canadian Shack invited authors to come up with new and inventive ways for any given fictional couple to end up in a small cabin in northern Canada. The tight parameters, fixed goal of 101 stories, and open admission invited anyone to play along and help the community win this absurdist game. Fanfiction holidays include the MMOM, or Merry Month of Masturbation, in which fan authors are challenged to post anonymous stories on the theme of self-pleasure every day for the entire month of May. The MMOM functions as a game both because it is difficult to keep up with such a demanding writing task, and thus to win, but also because the theme produces an archive of numerous similar stories that may be directly compared, and as a result, authors compete to write the most sexy, outlandish, or surprising story in the collection. More Joy Day and 14 Valentines also mark the fanfiction festive calendar, each requiring participants to create fan art, fiction, playlists, and videos as a gift to the community. Likewise, the massive, small fandom exchange Yuletide functions as a game for several reasons. Yuletide allows participants to specify 3 extremely obscure source texts, and then uses an algorithm to anonymously match participants with a compatible author. Authors have about 1 month to write a story of at least 1,000 words in one of these fandoms, which will please their recipient and hopefully also the fan community at large. The archive becomes publicly available on Christmas, and authors' identities are revealed on New Year's Day. Gameplay elements enter Yuletide first due to its festival nature as a fan-specific seasonal holiday, wherein stories compete, in a sense, to become the most beloved, widely read, shocking, clever, and exciting story of the year. Secondly, because Yuletide has incredibly tight writing parameters and deadlines, it requires great creativity and craft to win by successfully finishing a story in time that pleases both the specific recipient of the story gift and the community. Likewise, because Yuletide stories are based on unusual sources that are difficult to write fanfiction about, the resulting stories often play at the boundaries of fan genres. For example, stories like Wait, Wait, Don't Eat Me, about zombies attacking a well-known public radio show, or very sexual explorations of children's programming like the Care Bears or Calvin and Hobbes, as well as stories based on ephemeral media like blogs, coffee commercials, or pop songs, all engage in a kind of language game, challenging authors and readers to reimagine the limits of fan creativity and the boundaries of the fan playground. Third, and finally, the anonymous Yuletide entries also become the basis of a 2-week guessing game, from their posting on Christmas until the author's identities are revealed on New Year's Day. In that time, readers compete with each other to read and comment on as many stories as possible before the reveal, and to guess the identities of the anonymous authors. Because Yuletide specializes only in deliberately obscure media, this last stage of the festival often also involves playful engagement with many story worlds that readers are unfamiliar with. They must thus playfully reconstruct many fictional spaces, characters, and universes in reverse, using only the clues provided in the transformed fan work, and immersively enter the lives of many unfamiliar characters. Thus, like a character in a role-playing game who must slowly tease out the rules of the story world they inhabit through a series of gameplay actions, readers in Yuletide enter numerous story worlds that they playfully fill out by identifying with new characters and engaging with new story elements. To get a sense of how Yuletide functions as a form of play that includes game elements and immersive role-play elements, let's take a look at the following fan video, which was made to celebrate Yuletide. Called One Night Fandoms by Eruthros and Things with Wings, this video takes short clips from a small fraction of the sources included in Yuletide. The choice of Angel of the Morning as the vid's soundtrack emphasizes the ephemeral nature of the festival as a collection about sources that can only exist for the Yuletide season and will likely not reappear in fan culture until the following year. To play along, see how many media sources you can identify, and please do feel free to cheer or call out the names as we're watching. It's a game.
Strings to bind your hands, not if my love can bind your heart. And there's no need to take a stand, for it was I who chose to start. I see no reason to take me home. I am old enough to face the dawn. Just call me angel of the morning, angel. Just touch my cheek before you leave me, oh baby. Just call me angel of the morning, angel. Then slowly turn away from me. Maybe the sun's light will be dim, so it won't matter anyhow. If morning's echo says we sin, well, it was what I wanted now. And if we're victims of the night, I won't be blinded by the light. Just call me angel of the morning, angel. Just touch my cheek before you leave me, oh baby. Just call me angel of the morning, angel. Then slowly turn away. I won't beg you to stay with me through that season of the pain of the years. Oh baby, 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 baby. Just call me angel of the morning, angel. Just touch my cheek before you leave me, baby. Just call me angel of the morning, angel. Just touch my cheek before you leave me, baby, oh baby.
Okay, who thinks they got 10? How about 20? 30? So, in conclusion, while at first glance fan fiction and role-playing games appear to share little in common other than the underlying infrastructure of fan culture, In both structural and social ways, these forms draw upon shared thematics, pleasures, and practices. Thank you very much.
Est-ce qu'il y a des questions? Oui, on va essayer de traduire.
Okay, so isn't fan fiction losing something that is in the role-playing game? As in, I may not be translating that correctly. La tradition orale, the oral tradition.
So does fan fiction lose something because it's written rather than oral? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Well, I would say that... Yeah, sure. I would say that certainly it is different than oral storytelling, but that it plays upon many of the same elements because fan fiction is embedded within a very active culture. It does have a lot of the elements that we associate with oral storytelling, like the direct connection with the audience, immediate commenting, a kind of cultural context where authors are constantly responding to each other. And then I would also say that because there are oral versions of fan fiction in oral recordings in podfic, that there is also that kind of connection to oral storytelling. Some pieces of fan fiction are later read as oral pieces, and some are actually oral first and then go into the written version. So I would say that all of these things are more interconnected than we might expect.
Excuse me, but I've heard once role play is a story that you que tu racontes. That you tell with many people, but fan fiction is read by only one.
Not always, I would say. On the one hand, I would kind of point to some of these archives that I'm discussing where people are writing very similar stories and they all end up in one archive. In many ways, that's kind of a collectively authored overall kind of universe that's being built by many people together. But also, there is this practice of many authors in a chat room writing a piece of fan fiction together, each pretending to be a character. And that's probably the most direct connection to role-playing games, where each person pretends to be a character and they write the piece of fan fiction together on the fly as a chat form. That's probably the most direct connection to role-playing games. The rest is a bit more metaphorical, draws out the connection a little further, but in that case, it's really quite close.
Hi. My question is more from the point of view of RPG author. So I must say I'm quite hostile towards the idea that role-playing game would be a kind of a fan fiction, with the idea that if we do so as authors, we tend to just repeat the same thing in a certain way, and of course you can pay a tribute, or you can you're inspired by many things. No one creates anything out of the blue, but while fan fictions are fan fictions and therefore are made to honor a kind of fiction or something, I have the feeling that role-playing games could be in a certain way much more than just paying tribute to other media or other pieces of work. And I would rather say that the real fan fiction in a certain way is not the role-playing game per se, but rather the game that is produced. When you play a role-playing game, you tend to create your own fan fiction of D&D, vampire, if I'm a GM at Vampire, I would tend to put what I like the most in the universe of Vampire. So that's why I'd like to point out this issue, or rather say that the fan fiction in role-playing game is the game itself, rather than the game that is made or should be. But again, it's a position of an author, not an academic on the subject.
So I'm not sure if I completely understand the distinction that you're making, but I'll just briefly comment on, I guess, this idea of originality and connection to an original source. Because I think that I would probably argue that both role-playing games and fan fiction, but also kind of all media, is really drawing on other sources and really reinterpreting kind of similar structures and similar mythologies and similar kind of cultural knowledges. And especially in fan fiction, this distinction between original fiction and fan fiction is very, very blurry, because it's largely a question of copyright. It's largely a question of corporate ownership. Because, of course, there are pieces of media that very, very directly follow on others, like the recent boom in Sherlock Holmes-related things, because Sherlock Holmes is out of copyright, except, of course, according to the one crazy woman who is like the ex-wife of somebody who is related to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and is now suing. But for the most part, most of us believe it's out of copyright. And so these are, in many ways, kind of artificial distinctions. And whenever we have this kind of collective practice of reinterpreting a shared cultural mythology, I mean, I think that's what we're most often doing in any form of storytelling. So, I don't know if that directly responds to the issue that you raised, but hopefully that's a bit adjacent. Yeah.
Hi, I don't know much about fan fiction, and I was very surprised by the examples you gave us. I had in my mind that fan fiction was just in the continuity of what had been done, and you showed us a patchwork of many different things. Is this kind of work a mainstream within the fan fiction, or is it quite original?
I would say that some of the pieces that I talked about are unusual, but in general, I would say that fan fiction, which is very critical of the original, is very, very common, is very mainstream. And that often one of the biggest motivating factors for writing fan fiction is that feeling like, I was watching this show and then they got it so wrong and now I'm going to fix it, right? Or also the alternate universe style of fan fiction is very, very common. And this, again, in many ways kind of draws on that idea of role play. Like, I like this role, but I would like to put it in a completely different setting. And so the idea of, well, I really like, supernatural, but I would like it better if those characters were detectives in the 1920s. And so that's also a really common form of fan fiction, where you completely break from the original setting, the original genre. These are all quite common, yeah.
There's an episode in Supernatural where...
Yes. Yes, Supernatural is maybe a bad example because they actually draw on fan fiction so much. But yes, and very often fan fiction completely breaks from the original boundaries of the genre. Yeah.
Bon, merci, on va s'arrêter là pour passer à la table ronde. Merci pour cet interlude anglophone. Merci à tout le monde d'avoir joué le jeu. Qui fait la table ronde?